about the heart. So we're going to start with the cardiovascular system and talk a little bit or a lot about how our heart works.
There's a great new craze that's sweeping the nation. Come on to circulation. Starts with your heart, what a great sensation. Come on to circulation. Out through your arteries, into your veins. Your heart pumps your blood, then it does it again. So come on, everyone, get it on, everyone. Circulation. So come on, everybody, exercise your body for circulation. Circulation, everybody form a circle now. Circulation, like your blood, you just start moving around. Circulation is a function that's so outside. And if you keep on sleeping, you're not circulating right. You got 4 heart parts to pump the blood. Yeah, that's circulation. Left and right ventricle, left and right atrium. Yeah, they do it. They circulate. They pump blood through your lungs for oxygen, and then your arteries take it through to your body, and your veins bring the old blood back to be renewed. Circulation takes nutrition to your cells and gets rid of carbon dioxide and waste as well. Circulation is the function that's so out of sight. And if your hands are cold, then you're not circulating right. Well, your blood is such a life-giving potion. Like a river, it's always in motion. From your head to your toes, doing good as it goes. It's a big, red, beautiful ocean. Now the blood's not bad, it's kind of special. Yeah, come dig it, circulate with red and white corpuscle cells. Yeah, come do it, circulation. Red cells carry oxygen, white cells fight the germs. So come on, come do it, yeah, come do it, circulation. So come do it, come do it, circulation. Circulation, everybody form a circle now. Circulation, like your blood, you just start moving around. Circulation is the function that's so outside. You can circulate right. There's a great new craze that's sweeping the nation. Come on to circulation. Starts with your heart, what a great sensation. Come do it, circulate. Out through your arteries, in through your veins. Your heart pumps your blood, then it does it again. Come on, everybody get it on, everybody. Circulation. So come on, everybody get it on, everybody. Circulation. The circulation.
Yeah, I'm sure you're like, whoa, I'm glad that's over, or you fast forward through it. But yeah, circulation is what we're going to talk about today. And basically, when we're talking about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the hearts and the vessels. And essentially, we have 2 different classifications. We have what's considered exothermic organisms. These are cold-blooded, things like fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Then we have what's known as endothermic, which are warm-blooded organisms like blood and mammals. And, not all organisms have their heart, which is the organ that is important in transporting blood throughout the body. And not all organisms have the same structural organization of their heart the same. For instance, fish have 2 chambers of their heart. In their heart. It's a single heart that consists of just one atrium and what's known as one ventricle. There's no separation between oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood, as it moves through there. So when we're talking about the heart, we're talking about chambers within it. And basically, the chambers, either known as atrium or ventricles, we have basically 4 different chambers in our heart. We have 2 atriums and 2 ventricles, and we're going to talk about one's for essentially when we're looking at them towards the top, The chambers that are towards the top of the heart in us are going to be what receives blood, and essentially the chambers at the bottom are going to be what essentially pushes blood out. And for us, that's the case, but not for all organisms. Another example is amphibians. They have 3 chambers. That includes what they know as a right atrium and left atrium and only 1 ventricle. And as I said, we had 2. And they have incomplete double circulation. And so reptiles have 3 chambers in the heart. There includes a right atrium, left atrium, and 1 ventricle. This again is an incomplete double circulation. Birds, they have 4 chambers of the heart. That includes a right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. Like us, one side handles oxygen poor blood while the other handles oxygen rich. So when we're looking at birds in relationship to fish, amphibian, and reptiles, birds are closest to us, closest to mammals. Mammals also have 4-chamber heart. That includes right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. And one side handles oxygen poor blood and the other handles oxygen rich. In birds and mammals, like us, they have what's called complete double circulation, which means the oxygen rich and the oxygen poor blood does not mix. And so let's look. We have what's called pulmonary and systematic circulation. And basically, if you notice here, the heart is a transport system. So that's what this guy right here, it's a transport system. And if you look, the pulmonary circuit is what comes up and goes to the lungs, right? And then you have the systematic circulation that comes and goes to all the organs. And the heart is what's essentially there pumping it. So if you look on here, on the right side, you'll see oxygen poor blood, right? And so this right side, and when we're talking about the right side, it's not when you're looking at it necessarily the right side, it's how it's in your body. So the right side here is oxygen poor, which means it has less oxygen, right? And then the left side here is oxygen rich. And so let's talk about this really quick, right? And so on the pulmonary circuit, what's happening is the blood is leaving the heart and going up to the lungs, where O2 is coming into the body and going into these capillary beds. And so when you come back down from the lungs, you'll notice that it's nice and rich, which is going to signify that it has oxygen in it. Blue color is what we represent as being oxygen poor. Now, if you see when it leaves the heart and goes to the body, on the right side here, you're going to notice that on the left side here, you're going to notice that it's full of oxygen, because basically it's transporting out to the organs, and then so it's going to leave to go into the tissue, and so it's going to come back to the heart, so then it can go into pulmonary circulation. So at no point do these 2 oxygen rich and oxygen poor bloods do they ever come in combined. And so the whole purpose of the pulmonary circulation is to basically take the blood that's high in CO2, low in oxygen, go to the lungs, get rid of the CO2, get loaded with oxygen, come back to the heart. And the whole purpose of the systematic circuit is to take that oxygen-rich blood, take that oxygen to the organs, and then once the organs use it, it's going to spit out CO2, and then that can come back to the heart so that we can get it to the pulmonary. So this is what's known as complete double circulation. So let's talk about what we've receives and basically what pumps. So if you notice here, the receiving chambers are the atriums. So you can see on this part right here, you have the right atrium on this side. So this is receiving blood. And it's receiving blood from the systematic circuit, which means that the blood it is getting is oxygen poor. The left atrium, which is over here, is receiving blood from the pulmonary circuit. So it is high in oxygen. So those are the two receiving chambers of the heart. Now, if you look a little bit lower to the bottom, you'll notice down here is the right ventricle. And the right ventricle actually pumps blood. And that is to the pulmonary circuit. So this is actually, so this is actually low in oxygen. The left ventricle is pumping blood to the systemic circuit, which is high in oxygen, and that is over here, right? And so those are essentially the different regions. Now, if we're looking at this heart, if you see this towards the bottom, this is what's known as the apex, because it comes down to a point. And up here on this side is what's known as the base. Now, this apex points towards the hip. Okay. And this base on the posterior surface, or towards the back, actually goes towards the right shoulder. And what I would just do is just kind of, while you're going at it, point and kind of feel on your body where these different things are. So basically, there's what's known as an apical impulse that you can feel, and that's the pulse, the point that has the maximum pulse. And that is somewhere, if you're looking between the 5th and 6th rib, just below the nipple. So that's essentially why when they're listening for your heartbeat, that is the place that they always tend to go to, because that is where it's going to be that maximum pulse that they can hear the best. And so here is where you can see, so the sternum, or that mid-sternal line, goes straight down the middle, right? And you can see up here the second rib and where the diaphragm is. And so down here is that apex. Up here is that base, right? And then if you look really closely, this is between the 5th and 6th, and that's the location of the apical impulse. Okay. And so essentially this is the point of max impulse. And if you look towards the posterior region here, right, and that's where you can kind of see towards the back, that's where the basically base is going to go towards, and you can see that's the area where those atriums are a little bit bigger, and you can see those walls of the ventricle being very, very thick. So that mediastinum can kind of give you an idea of location of the heart. The heart is about the size on a normal adult of 2 fists, and it weighs about 1 pound. Now let's talk about the covering. The covering is this double-walled sac that surrounds the heart. It's called the pericardium. And essentially, it has different layers. It's made up of 2 main layers, which is called the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is the thickest, and it's the outer layer, right? And so this guy functions to protect. It also is there to help anchor the heart with the surroundings and prevent overflow. The serous pericardium has both what's known as the parietal layer and the visceral layer. And if you remember, the visceral layer is the inner layer, and this thing cannot be removed. And this is what's going to for the serous membrane, the middle layer. So between these 2 layers is where the fluid is going to be filled. And you should have talked about this in Anatomy and Physiology 1. And so if the pericardium becomes inflamed at any time, right, we have this 2 layers that are separated by fluid, which is called the pericardial cavity. This is right here between the parietal layer and the visceral layer. This helps to decrease basically friction, right? And so if you have any kind of inflammation of this pericardial cavity, it's what's known as pericarditis. And guys, this basically feels like a heart attack. It's not, but it feels like it. So what they end up having to do is they have to pull out fluid from it. So that's the covering, right, of the heart. Now the heart is actually made up of 3 layers. The outermost layer is what's called the epicardium. It's kind of this visceral layer of serous pericardium, right? So this is right under the visceral pericardium. Or that visceral layer, the serous membrane. Then you have, right underneath that is a myocardium. And this is going to be where the muscle cells are, the cardiac muscles, right? So this is the middle layer, and it is the thickest layer. And the endocardium is the innermost layer, right? It is continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessel, right? So this is basically lines the heart chambers and covers cardiac skeleton of valves. Now, this endocardium can become inflamed as well, and this is what's known as endocarditis. So this is inflammation, right, of this endothelial lining. And this is normally caused by high blood pressure. So let's look at this really quick so that we can see these different layers all in perspective. And so if you look here, right, this is taking a big chunk out of the top of the heart right there. And you'll see that layer on the outside, right? You'll see where you have the myocardium, that's here, and the pericardium, that's out here. So let's look. We said we had the pericardium and we had 2 layers. So this is the first outer layer, right? The thickest outer layer of the pericardium, and then the parietal layer area of the serous pericardium, right? So you have, this is the fibrous, this is the serous, this is the serous, right? And this is the pericardial cavity where you find the fluid. So all of this right here, right, is the serous membrane or the serous membranes that come through there. Now, part of the heart wall is the visceral layer of that pericardium, which is also known as the epicardium, right? And then underneath that is the myocardium. That's where the muscle cells are found, right? Endocardium, which is basically the lining. And then you get the heart chamber there, which is basically the lumen, right? That's the space inside the atrium or the ventricle. So that's all the different arrangements and how it works. And then you'll see that the cardiac muscle fibers are in these different arrangements to help with maximum output whenever it contracts. And so if we look at this great part, right, you can go and you can kind of go up through here and you can see the right and the left when we're looking at different points. So the right side basically has low pressure. And the right side, or the left on here, this is the right side, and then the left side has high pressure. Right. And so if we're looking at this, we can look at some of the surface features that we can see on the skies. One of them is right here, right? The right coronary artery in what's known as the coronary sulcus. And so this coronary sulcus is going to be this indentation that you get these different, specifically here, that right coronary artery. So these are just kind of these indentions that allow the blood vessels to kind of fit within. And you can see the coronary sulcus is where the coronary artery fits in. The intraventricular sulcus is going to be where the intraventricular artery falls in. So the sulcus, think a lot of like the sulci when we were talking about in the brain, right? The same idea. So these are just these indentions. Now, what we're going to talk about more here when we go through this is all the different parts and what they do. So, now with babies and us, they get their oxygen or the oxygen a little bit differently than us. We'll talk about this more here. This ligamentum arteriosum is basically where babies end up getting their O2. And that's going to change. Right now, it's a ligament that helps to keep that left pulmonary artery attached to the aortic arch. But in basically fetuses, it's a little bit different. So, but we'll hit more on that here in a little bit. But we get our O2 from oxygen within the blood, and it's pumped through our bodies using this mechanism. And again, you can see here, there's another sulcus, and this is this main, basically artery that's in the back. So the wherever there's this vessel that's attached, there's extra dense connective tissue around it that helps to secure these vessels. So these are the three main sulcuses that we see within our heart that allows for those arteries to be there. And we are going to talk more about functions later in this talk of all those. So let's talk about really quick atria, and these are the receiving chambers, and they're at the superior part of the heart. They're small, very thin-walled chambers that contribute little to the propulsion of the blood. So they're mostly receiving chambers, right? On top of these atria, basically are auricles. And these auricles are important because they are appendages resting on the heart that increases atrial volume. The right atrium is important because it's going to receive deoxygenated blood. So this is blood that does not have oxygen in it, right? Where the left atrium is going to receive oxygenated blood. Now, the right atrium actually has 3 veins that go to it. There's the first one that's called the superior vena cava. Second one is the inferior vena cava. And the third one is the coronary sinus. And that returns from the coronary vein. The left atrium actually receives blood from 4 pulmonary veins that are coming back from the lungs. And so when we're looking at this, which when we look at the next page, we're going to see that they are actually separated by what's known as an interatrial septum. Interatrial septum. Okay. So let's go and let's look at the heart. So if we look in here, this right here is the right atrium, right? You can't see the auricles on the top of them because they're little flaps. But you can see right here, we have the superior vena cava right here. You have the inferior vena cava that's over here. And then you essentially have, which you can't really see in here, the coronary coming because it's been cut off. So those are the 3 vessels or veins that come to that area. Now over here is the left atrium, and you can see basically the right pulmonary veins and the left pulmonary veins you can see them here, there'll be 2 over here, come into that area to leave. Now you can't see it because you have this pulmonary truck in front of it, but there is an area in the middle that separates the 2, and that's what's known as that interatrial septum that separates the atriums. Now if you look within the atrium itself, you'll notice what's called a fossa ovalis. And so this is another place. So this is a remnant of what's known as the foramen ovale. And the foramen ovale is basically where the fetus gets O2 from the mom's blood here. And so that's kind of showing you the gross anatomy of the atriums. Now let's look at the ventricles. So basically, the ventricles are the discharge chambers. So this takes most of the volume of the heart. So the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk. The left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta. This is the biggest artery. The trabeculae carnae is the ventricle muscles. And the papillary muscles actually anchor the chordae tendineae. And these are basically attached to the valves of the heart that separate the different chambers. So let's look at this, all these different parts in the next picture. So if you can see down here, you have the right ventricle here, right? And so you can see on here that when it pumps, that the blood is going to come into here, right, from the atrium, and then it's going to go here through what's known as the pulmonary veins, or the pulmonary arteries, also known as the trunk. Sorry. So that's the right ventricle. Over here is the left ventricle. And this is going to, you can see it goes through here, and that's going to go out here to the aorta, right? And so if you look close, the trabeculae carnae is here, and you can see that is all the basically ventricular muscles in there. And you can see it kind of all over. So these are going to be the muscles that are not connected here. The muscles that are connected here are the papillary muscles, and those are what's going to basically hold the valves in place. And the valves are these little doors that essentially are going to close to allow blood flow to stop between the different chambers. Now here is the interventricular septum, and so this one is really, really, really thick. And essentially that is separating the two sides. And you can see over here that this wall here is much thicker than this wall here. And that'll make a lot of sense because the left ventricle is responsible for pushing the blood through the systemic circulation, where the right ventricle is responsible for pushing blood to the pulmonary circuit. So think about how much more force it's going to take to push blood all the way down to your toes from your heart versus pushing blood just to your lungs from your heart. So that should explain some of the differences there. And you can see earlier, I should have pointed these out, the pectinate muscles that are here are those muscles that are in the atrium that help with the auricles and getting blood in out of that area. Now we haven't hit on the valves yet, but for the most part, you should be able to label everything that's on this heart. Now, when we're talking about the development aspect of the heart, everything derives from the area of the mesoderm And it begins as two endothelial chambers that fuse to form a single actively pumping heart. And basically, this happens by day 22. So tubes develop from four bulges that represent the earliest chambers, right? So the sinus venosus will end up becoming what we know as the right atrium, the coronary sinus, and later what we will know as the SA node. And you're going to know what every single one of these are here soon. The atrium and this early developmental heart will end up becoming the pectinate muscle of the atria. The ventricle of that will become the left ventricle. And the bulbus cordis will become what's known as the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, and the right ventricle. So let's look at a picture of this really quick. So if you notice this part down here, that's what's known as the sinus venosus, right? And so that's going to basically wrap around. You can see it starts day 20. The endothelial tissues here begin to fuse, you'll notice, right? Then day 22, the heart starts to pump. You can see that they're kind of budgeting out here from those kind of tubes. By day 24, the heart continues to bend and elongate. So you start out at the bottom here with that sinus venosus, and over time what happens is that guy continues to kind of move up. If you see this, which is the ventricle, this is going to end up moving down, and as it takes it, it's going to push this kind of up and this off towards the top and the side, right? So this ends up being you can see the atrium here over time. This right here is going to be the ventricles, right? This right here is essentially going to be the aorta or pulmonary trunk and right ventricle. And this at the very, very top is going to be what essentially leads into that. And it kind of shows you here a really nice rendition of how it goes straight to begin with and then kind of curves around and it continues to curve and go up. And so this is kind of showing by day 35, the bending is complete. So it takes about 15 days for the heart to form. So it continues, the heart contorts and structural changes convert into four chamber by, if you remember, I said day 35. And so the two fetal heart structures that bypass the pulmonary circulation, because we don't use this at first, is the foramen ovale, which is the opening that connects the connects the atria, right? So this is what ends up being the fossa ovalis once we get, and so this is how the fetus gets O2. And the ductus arteriosus connects the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. And so this is basically develops into what we know as the ligamentum arteriosum. And so this in the fetus is the blood vessel that bypasses the right ventricle aka lungs. Think. The baby's not using its lungs, it's not breathing, so it can't use the pulmonary circulation. So it's going to kind of rot around that for a while, and this is how it does it. And it closes at or shortly after birth. Now, we can have homeostatic defects. Our most common birth defects is congenital heart defect, which is about 40,000 cases per year. It can be corrected with surgery. Most defects are one of two types. Either you have mixing of oxygen poor and oxygen rich, as in septal defects. Remember, we look at the interventricular septum and the interarterial septum. So if something is not right there, they can cross. You can also get the narrowed valves or vessels that cause increased workload on the heart, as in coarctation of the aorta. So a very common one is called the tetralogy of Fallot, where you have both of these happening. And so what this means is that you can have kind of a thick septal defect, which is basically the intraventricular septum between in the right ventricle, right? So you get mixing of blood. On top of that, you get the pulmonary valve that blocks. And so this increases workload. So let's kind of look at this so that we can look at a combination of both so that you can get a visual of what I'm talking about. So this is the A is the ventricular septum defect. This happens about 1 in every 500 births. So you can see right here that intraventricular septum fails to form. So it allows blood to basically go back and forth, flowing between the two ventricles. Now the problem here is, if you remember, I was talking about how this left ventricle is so much stronger because it's pushing the blood throughout the whole body. So more blood tends to go in here versus the other way, right? And so you're getting less of that oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So this is the ventricular septal defect. The second one that we looked at is that coarctation of the aorta. So if you look here, the aorta should be way down here. It should be quite a bit bigger than what it is. So it's kind of narrowed, and because it's narrowed, you can't get as much blood out there, so it's going to increase workload. So in this tetralogy of Fallot, basically you're looking at multiple defects, and tetra meaning there's 4. And so when we're looking at the pulmonary trunk is too narrow, and the pulmonary valve isn't working right. And this is basically it's through stenosis, right? And so on here, if you look, the pulmonary trunk coming through here, and you can see that. So this is the first area that you're having problem with. The right ventricle, if you notice, is really thick there, and so it's hypertrophic. So it's going to be, you're going to be less blood that can flow in there, and it's going to be harder for it to push it out. You have the ventricular septum defect there, of course, again. And you can see here, the aorta is going to open from both ventricles, basically. So this occurs in 1 in every 2,000 births and can be detrimental to life if it's not remedied. So we talked a little bit about basically the pulmonary valve not working correctly. And so what are valves? Heart valves, are there to ensure that the blood flows in just one direction, and they open to allow blood to go through, and then they close to stop blood. And they basically open and close in response to pressure. So you have what's known as the atrioventricular valve and the semilunar valve. And so the atrioventricular valves are located between the atria and the ventricles. So if we're looking at our heart like this, right? Basically, these valves are going to be between these guys and these guys, right? And the semilunar valves are going to be between the ventricles that are down here and what's ever leaving, or the major arteries, right? So let's look at these. There are no major valves that are found between major veins in the atria, right? Not a problem, because basically when we're looking at this, the inertia of incoming blood prevents black flow, and the heart contracts, compressing the veins to open. So that's why we don't end up needing them. So if you do this cut across the heart to separate the top from the bottom, you can actually see these different guys, right? So you have the another picture here. Yeah, I'm going to show one right after this. So you're able to see here is the left atrioventricular valve, the right atrioventricular valve, and you can see that those two guys are really big. And then you have the aortic and pulmonary valve, which essentially are the semilunar valves. Right? You notice they have names because it's a difference between the general naming or nomenclature of them, right? So they're also known, if you look at the left atrioventricular valve, it's also known as the mitral valve, and the right atrioventricular is known as a tricuspid, and it has to do with how many flaps. This one has 3, 1, 2, 3. The mitral has 2. You notice that the semilunar valves here that are located, the aortic and the pulmonary valve, both have 3, but they are much smaller. So let's see a side view of this so we can get a better idea of what they look like or where they're located. So we have 2 AV valves, or atrioventricular valves. They prevent black flow into the atria when ventricles are contracted. So here we have the tricuspid valve, which is the right atrioventricular. And so here you have basically 3 cusps, or these valves. So this is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, right? So it helps you with right atrium, AV, atrioventricular, known as the tricuspid. You ask, what name do you need to know? Both. The left AV is the mitral valve, and it's a bicuspid. So there are 2 cusps. It's known as the mitral or the bicuspid valve because it's 2, right? And this is between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now, as I showed you earlier, that chordae tendineae are those basically those cords that anchor on the cusp of the AV valves, and they connect to the papillary muscles, and their function is to hold the flaps closed in position and prevent the flaps from ever going back into the atrium when they push through. And so as you can see here, you have the right atrium. the right atrium and left atrium here, right? Color. And so, like that. And so the one that goes through those is the tricuspid. Right? And then if you look at the left atrium and left ventricle right here, you'll see this mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid. Right? So tricuspid and bicuspid, I realize they do have a few different names to them, right? And so you can remember which one has which, because if you think about lab rat, right? Left atrium, bi, right? So that gives you the bicuspid. Right atrium, tri, which is the tricuspid, right? And if you're trying to figure out what the order of the valves that they go through, you can think of two. There's two different ones that you can do. Tissue, paper, my asset, or the peanut butter awesome. So it goes through the tricuspid to the pulmonary, either to the bicuspid or mitral, to the aortic valve. So, on here. So, let me see if it's going to show. So these are the two ways that you can do it. And let's look at the next picture so we can get an idea. Or actually, I'm going to go back here a couple so you can see from this guy which one I'm talking about. So, as you know, blood comes in here and goes through the tricuspid valve. And then when it leaves to go to the lungs, it goes through the pulmonary valve. When it comes back in, it goes through the bicuspid or mitral. And as it goes out, you'll see it right there is the aortic valve. So those are the four different valves that it goes through. And you can remember it by either saying tissue, paper, my asset, or the peanut butter awesome. And this just kind of gives you an idea of how the AV valve opens when the pressure comes. So basically, when we have pressure coming in, there's a lot of blood coming back from both the inferior and superior vena cava and that coronary sinus. So the blood returning to the heart fills the atria, pressing against this valve that's right here. That increased pressure forces the AV valve to open. As the ventricle fills, the AV valve flaps hang lymphly into the ventricle, so it keeps it and just kind of opens. Once the atria contracts, forcing additional blood into the ventricle, that's when it's basically going to then slap close. And basically, because at the time, the atrium pressure from all the blood flowing in there is greater than the ventricular pressure. The atrioventricular valve opens. Once that atrial pressure reduces, then it flaps closed. So it's kind of like the idea is if you have a door that has one of those automatic door closers, when there's enough pressure to push it open, it'll open and come, but as soon as that pressure is gone, it forces back closed. And this again is just kind of showing you the pictures of those different valves. There are 2 semilunar valves that prevent backflow from major arteries back into the ventricles. So they open and close in response to pressure changes as well. Each valve consists of 3 cusps that roughly resemble a half moon. The pulmonary semilunar valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. The aortic semilunar valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. So if you look in here, as the ventricle contracts and the intraventricular pressure rises, here, right, blood is pushed up against the semilunar valves and opens and leaves. And so this is when these guys contract here, right? You can see that blood is going to be pushed open. As the ventricle relaxes, though, this pressure falls, so it's not strong enough to push through there. So the blood flows back from the artery slightly, filling these cusps. So do you see how these guys go like this? So they fill them, and them filling them slightly like this causes them to close, right? So if you can see, you have this pressure filling. But do you see how they look like little bowls? So once the pressure alleviates down here, the blood is going to start flowing back, but it's going to flow into these little bowls. And once the bowls are full, it's going to close them. And so at this point, we are going to take a break, and you can do your activity of labeling the heart.